Hi, everyone, and welcome to Perspectives, Edmentum's virtual event series, where we gather educators from across the country to talk about topics that are top of mind for all of you right now. Today, we're going to talk about strategies to support the whole learner, not just academically, but emotionally as well. My name is Jason Mitchell, and I'll be your host today. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy Leadership here at Edmentum, and our team helps to identify innovative educators, promising practices, and we give those educators, leaders, a platform to share their strategies, their insights, their expertise, and even practical tips that you can use when you go back into your schools. Now, I know that most of us have been on a Zoom webinar for the past couple of years, but I just did want to do a quick housekeeping item. There's a couple things on here. The main one is that we encourage you to use the chat to get to know one another, and to use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen to submit questions to panelists. We'll get to those a little later on. You'll also see a few poll questions pop up as we move through today's discussion. If you have the chance, go ahead and answer those. It'll help us get a feel of the lens that you look through and what's going on in your world and your districts. And we'll share those answers out with the group. In fact, let's actually start with the first poll. So I want to see where everybody is here on the call today when it comes to the concept of the whole learner. So let's look at this. Are you already a practitioner of whole learning? Are you familiar with the idea, but just at the beginning stage? You know just a little, or is this totally new for you? I want to take a little more time while you all are filling in those answers to talk about the whole learner approach. So this approach enables children to thrive today, and it helps them create productive and engaged citizens of tomorrow. So the science of learning and development, it tells us that learners of all ages, they need a variety of healthy, engaged learning experiences. To optimize opportunities for success, learners need these experiences that are grounded in strong developmental relationships and safe environments, and to support the development of a broad set of physical, social, cognitive, creative, and emotional skills. All this is essential to advancing the positive outcomes for all students. Okay, let me lean in a little closer so I can read this. And we're going to take a look at this first poll and see where everybody's at in regards to the idea of whole learning. Okay, so let me see. So we've got about 25% says I'm a practitioner. We've got 50% that says I'm familiar and beginning some implementation. And then we've got 25% that says I'm not familiar at all. So we've got a broad set of knowledge base here. The good news is that we have an incredible set of panelists today. I'm delighted to welcome to our conversation. So they've been promoting and expanding the focus of whole learner for years, and they bring this really deep level of expertise and passion to the topic today. So as we begin, I'd love to invite each of our panelists to share their mission and how their work contributes to our conversation. So first up, we've got Sean Slade. He's the head of education at BTS Spark. So Sean formerly served as the Senior Director of Global Outreach at the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, where Sean led actually, the ASCD whole child approach across the United States and globally. So Sean, tell us a little bit about your organization, BTS Sparks, and its focus on the whole learner.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jason. So as you mentioned, I was basically leading the whole child work at ASCD for really the past decade. So most of the from 2010 to about 2022. And then a year and a half ago, I moved to be head of education or head of BTS Spark, which is a not-for-profit organization focused on leadership development. And the link that we have there between what's, obviously a passion of mine, which is the whole learner and the whole child and reforming education, and the work we do at BTS Spark is we're really focused on developing what we call the whole educator or the whole leader. And so if we want to see the same development of the social, emotional, mental, physical, as well as cognitive development of our students, we also need to have the same development and understanding um, taught with our teachers, and more especially our school leaders, our principals, our superintendents, because they're the ones that actually really enhance and develop the culture and the process of what goes on in that school environment. So that's really our direction.
So this is a cause that you've championed for much of your career. Why is this so important to you? What makes this the passion of your work?
Yeah, you know what? Sometimes people say, they ask, how did you get to where you were, and what was the driving line? And I think it's pretty difficult to look into the future and say, this is where I intended to be. It's a lot easier to look in the rearview mirror and work out, okay, now I can understand what drove me. And for me, and I don't think I'm that different than most educators, I came into the profession believing that education was a great way to move the individual forward, but also society and the local community. And I always never believed that education was solely about content delivery. So it's not the the filling of a bucket, but a lighting of a fire. That was always part of my belief. And so everything I've done, from being a PE teacher and a social studies teacher, to being a researcher, to being a head of policy, to whole child, and now leading BTS Spark, the driving line or the path has always been, how do we really make education fulfill its potential in allowing to fulfill the potential of each individual? And so for those of us who got into education thinking that this is a great way, not only, or this is a great way to develop the whole person and develop them ready for society, that's what I believe in, and that's what I've been trying to drive and do throughout my entire career.
Boy, thank you for that, and thank you for all of your hard work in that vein. I mean, I think all of us who are in education, we remember that person who sort of lit that fire in us, and thank you for scaling that across the globe. Our next panelist is my colleague and my friend Jen Perry. She is the director of Whole Learner and SEL here at Edmentum. So Jen, just tell our audience a little bit about Edmentum's commitment to the whole learner, and why focusing on the whole learner is also important to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And I just loved Sean's reflections. It speaks a lot to some of the things that root me in my why. But I came to Edmentum in 2019, just before COVID, when Edmentum decided that not only did they want to continue working on quality virtual learning, but they wanted to begin to look at it from this larger lens that really incorporated the whole learner, the whole teacher, in a really human-centered approach to virtual learning. And recently we released a paper around that idea of human-centered approach. What I like about that is it talks about this idea that people are central to learning, right? Our connections and our relationships matter, whatever the tool is, right? We are vehicles for people to feel grounded and seen and whole. And so at Edmentum, we really look at every level of learning, whether it's understanding the basic needs of the folks who we're serving, cultivating relationships from a teacher-student perspective, but also from a partnership perspective, from how do we do the work that helps Sean do the work that he does, all of those different pieces. We look at fundamental skills that support successful academic outcomes, like executive function. We reflect the whole person in our values statement, right? So not only is this something that we believe we should be supporting customers with, but we believe internally that we need to turn that lens on ourselves. And so we've done things like create a partnership with Emory University. And right now we're doing some 2 cohort trainings around cognitive-based compassion training to improve our leadership and the work that we do in our academies. and really thinking about what is it about the context of people's lives that we can be supportive of in the areas that we are good at, that lift them into being their best selves. And so one of the tangible ways that Edmentum has supported whole learning is they hired a director of whole learner. And I get to work across the company in all sorts of ways to think about how those concepts fit into everything we do, and to help create a sustainable lens beyond just me as a person. And so, I think you want to what?
Sean. I'm going to steal Sean's term about so what lit your fire to drive you into this sort of facet of education?
So this is an interesting piece, and I guess, part of it is the way that I grew up. I grew up going into prisons at a very young age. My parents did some alternatives to violence work in prisons. And so I really was in a position to learn about the fact that there's greatness in everybody, and that there are just simply environments and systems issues and skills that people have not, for experience and exposure or structures, been able to acquire. And so my sort of purpose, my presentation has been about to try and see that greatness, that strength, that gift in every person. And so I started with kids who couldn't regulate their own behavior. I went for a good chunk of my career into elite boarding schools. And then I went back into the community to work with youth at Promise, who both in the residential school that I ran, and then in the community where I ran a juvenile justice diversion program and 2 non-secure detention facilities. What I learned in those experiences is that if we don't deal in all of those, regardless of the demographic, if we don't deal with what's going on in people's lives, right, then they're not at their full capacity for learning. And that we can do that in integrated ways in the classroom, in the way that we are with people. And that really elevates things. And one of the things that we know is that we don't know what kind of skills kids will need academically in the future, right? The world is changing so rapidly that we can't pinpoint they're going to need to know this math equation. We can't do that. But what we can do is we can identify that they need to be adaptable, Jason, like you. They need to be critical thinkers, problem solvers, and they need to be compassionate. And those are the kinds of things that we can really engage with in terms of higher learning and increasing higher learning. So that's
we're thrilled that you're a part of our team, and just the contribution that you make to the students that we serve is just extraordinary. So thank you.
Thank you.
Lastly, we have Brandon Frame. So Brandon works for the Urban Assembly, and he serves as the Senior Director of Social Emotional Learning in New York. So Brandon, tell us a little bit about the Urban Assembly and why you have chosen to focus on social and emotional learning.
Absolutely. I'm so honored to be here with everyone. So the Urban Assembly is a school support organization and consulting firm. We have 23 schools in New York City. They are our Department of Education and Schools, where we provide the school support to them across a myriad of areas. One of our major points and focus is to bring innovation to public education. I have the pleasure of leading up the social emotional learning department, where we are looking at social emotional learning, but specifically focused on implementation and thinking about how do we bring high quality implementation to schools so that they can do social emotional learning with fidelity across the school. How do you bring that coherence and alignment between your curriculum and your assessment and make it all work and make sense so that students can develop social emotional skills alongside their academic skills?
Well, that's fantastic. I have the privilege of working alongside with many New York City schools, and it's just extraordinary work that you're doing. So thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise. All right, but the real question is, what lit your fire? What drew you to this work?
What drew me to this work, I think that I was doing social emotional learning work before I kind of maybe even had the term social emotional learning. But I knew this was called something, right? Like I'm doing this work, working with young people. As a school leader before the Urban Assembly, as a teacher, I also spent time in private schools and working. And I just think about these experiences that I had, and this is called something. Sometimes people might even talk to them. I'm doing mentoring. I'm doing just these different things, and I'm like, what we're doing is we're building skills. And so social emotional learning gave me a language, some words, some definitions to what matters in life to navigate the complexity of life, or what Maurice Elias, Dr. Maurice Elias at Rutgers, what he says often, and I share it because I think this is what drives me, is that we have to prepare students not for a life of test, but the test of life. Right. And so I think that that's really important, right? Because like that's what we school can be just like this life of tests. You're just taking test. But what we want to do is provide them with the skills in order to master and move through and navigate the test of life, because it's going to everybody here can talk about some experiences that they've had, but it was their social emotional skills that they use to navigate the frustration, the challenges, and the obstacles. And we know that every single young person in the world needs to have them in order to navigate that.
Boy, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And it's just, I can hear it in your voice. I can hear that passion and that drive. So thank you for sharing that with the students of New York and across the nation. I am super excited about the experience and the expertise that this whole group brings to the table. So I wanted to actually provide a little framework for our conversation. And Brandon, you mentioned sort of that SEL helped you put a definition around what you were thinking. So I was actually going to start with a common definition of whole learning. And this was ASCD's definition of whole learning. Thought that might be a good starting point. So Sean, I'm sure you may have been involved in developing this definition. But it was interesting because when we pulled that definition, it says whole learning is defined as ensuring that each student is healthy, safe, engaged, supported, and challenged. And what's interesting about those descriptors is it's both aspirational and, as all of you attended to, it's necessary. These are the skills that our kids are going to need to be successful. So Sean, when you are thinking about explaining this approach to others, and how do you describe about what it is to focus on the whole learner, and what does that look like? And I think equally as important is, how is it different from what we see in a traditional classroom environment? I know I just asked you a whole bunch of questions there.
Yeah, I know I may talk for half an hour now, so you're welcome to stop me whenever you need to. And full disclosure, I didn't develop Tenants of the Whole Child at ASCD. They were developed by Dr. Jean Carter and a team of experts in about 2007. But I did come on in around 2010 to help lead and direct and grow it. So, and those tenants, the healthy, safe, engaged, supported, challenged, are actually, the order is specific because what they do is they align to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so things that we all need in order to not only survive but thrive. So there's a reason that healthy is at the bottom of that pyramid, or the first thing that we talk about, because if the child isn't healthy, then it's really difficult for them, as Jem was saying, to focus and concentrate and learn. You asked about what it looks like, and let me start off with a very basic example and then go into a little bit more detail. A couple of years ago, I was chatting with Arnie Duncan, the Education Secretary's policy director, and he said, if you could change anything about US education, what would it be? And I said, it sounds a little bit cliche, but if you could change the mindset of every educator in the US, that they're teaching children instead of teaching content,
yes,
just that concept would change almost everything that goes on inside the school and inside the classroom, because all of a sudden, if you, and most teachers do this, so this is not saying that they're not, most teachers are already doing this, like Brandon was saying, without realizing it or inherently, or they've come along to realize that knowing your students and making sure that they're well fed and they feel safe and they feel connected and they have a responsible adult that they can turn to. Those things are key. So it's really just talking about that as being fundamental. When we talk about whole child or a whole learner approach to education, it's both ensuring that there is enough of a wraparound services to make sure that child has nutrition, has health services, does feel safe, is getting the protections they need, but it's also a well-rounded approach to education. And so it is the social emotional learning. It is making sure that you're tapping into what they're intrigued about. It is really engaging them in not necessarily the content and the facts, but like Jen was saying, how do you get them to think creatively? How do you get them to think and problem solve? How do you get them to work collaboratively? So it's really more of a human side of education. Because as we keep saying at BTS Spark, it's, education is a human endeavor. And so we need to sort of really move education back towards being human-centric. It's, and you were asking at the end, I'm trying to go through the questions reasonably smoothly. You were asking how would it look different than a traditional classroom? And I would say, first of all, a lot of classrooms become whole learner or whole child focused because they understand after a while that that's actually what is most effective. So whether it's having the different groups of students work in collaboration, maybe it's project-based learning. You would go into classrooms and see groups of kids working on different things. You would see desks rearranged, being moved. You would see some kids over there in the corner. Some kids maybe outside doing their own experiments. You would see some kids working on their own, some kids working in pairs. It would be, what it wouldn't be is traditional lined up desks where the teacher is at the front of the classroom dictating what they should be doing and having everybody work on the same process at the same time. It would be a lot more discussion, the teacher as that guide on the side that we've been talking about for over a decade, the students having their own agency, having their own voice. That's what it would look like pedagogically. It would also be the teacher having a relationship and knowing what makes each of those students tick, what's going to actually inspire them. Why has Jen come into the classroom today and she's normally boisterous and noisy, but today she's quiet and reserved? And knowing that that's unusual for Jen, so I'm going to go and have a quiet conversation to see how things are. So it's basically being that conductor in an orchestra and understanding, all right, I need to make this happen over here, this happen over here, individually liaise with this person here, adjust the tempo to suit what the class and the individuals need at the same time. Try to answer as many questions in a short time, Jason. So
that was great. I think what you did was you really sort of provided illumination to that shift between delivering instruction and focusing on meeting the needs of the child. So I'm going to move to Jen next, and then Brandon, I'm going to have you talk a little bit about like the tactical application side of the equation. So from Jen, when you looked at this sort of from your perspective, how does that definition of whole learner compare what your world looks like, the lens that you look through every day.
Yeah. So, Edmentum has a whole learner model. We have a tree, and it really reflects exactly what Sean said, right? We start at the roots, and the roots are those Maslow's hierarchy of needs, health and safety, and those kinds of things. And then we move up through relationship and into the things that support good academics, like executive function, social emotional learning, and sort of equity. We look at the ideas of equity all the way through. So yeah, you can see that this is our learner model here. And so it really does, the reason that they agree, right, is that it's driven by science, multiple disciplines of science, right? Everything from psychology to neuroscience and all of those things, and we'll talk more about that later. I think the things that I would include that that Sean maybe hasn't said, and certainly are unique to my lens, are that we as a company look at everyone through that whole learner lens, including the educator, which I know, Sean, you do as well, and certainly Brandon, you do when you talk about implementation, right? And one of the things that's really important is understanding ourselves and what we bring to the table. And so my lens is, how does that translate into tangible curriculum? And how do we provide leaderships to schools and districts around the integration of what they're already doing? And so I'll give you a couple of examples of that. So I think about all of the things that Sean said, but also tone, right? So how do we talk to kids in ways that recognize them as whole learners and as whole people? In our curriculum, do we say, like, maybe Maria says, I want to build a robot. And we say, well, you have to do your chores first, is not a particularly engaging approach to getting kids to really buy into curriculum, but saying something like, wow, you're so creative. Let's think about how you can plan your time, right? In the same token, when I ran a school for kids who couldn't regulate their behavior, and we looked at what does a whole learner classroom look like, we would do things like, as part of giving teachers feedback on their approaches in their classroom, we'd look at, what does active engagement look like? Are you giving more corrective statements than you are positive, right? There's good research that says you need 3 to 5 positive statements to outweigh 1 corrective statement. So how are we interacting in a classroom that helps students feel like they can take risks, feel like they can be their whole and authentic selves? And sometimes it's as simple as thinking about how we deliver information, right? And so I really love the work that Sean's doing, and my lens is both all of those sort of tangible things in a classroom, but how do we display that in the curriculum that we're giving people? How do we use that curriculum to empower teachers to have more time to create safe environments for kids? More points of connection to look at what the data is telling them, and how they can think about a learner's strengths. So those would be the things that I would add. And I think Brandon's going to have some really concrete things too here.
Well, perfect. That's next in line. So Brandon, Sean and generally sort of talk about this at a high level macro. You look at this through the lens of, we're in the field, in schools, every day doing the work. Talk to me a little bit about the whole learner and what type of that framework as it pertains to the urban assembly, like how you support that framework within the schools that you support. And then to add a second piece of this question there, like what impact does that have on your students?
Oh, you're on mute, Brandon.
Absolutely. So when I think about this, I love what Sean said, and Sean, I just want to let you know, I may say what you said. I'm gonna do presentations. I'm like, if people thought about teaching children and not content, like, I just want to, that's stolen. I'm taking that with me. I'm gonna give credit, but I'm marching forward with that phrase there, because I think about, first, what are the challenges or the constraints? Is that especially when we get to middle school and high school. It starts a little bit around third grade, but more so when we get to middle school and high school, it becomes, I teach math, I teach science, right? But it does start in third grade, because in third grade, what happens? Kids read long passages, right? They take state tests. So we start really hyper focusing on this academic piece, and like we forgot, or we forget or don't want to do that social emotional development as intense as it was in like first and second grade. We've all been to the first and second grade classrooms, like, oh, this is so great. You feel good. It's a good day, good time to start your day. And so it becomes that constraint, because people are teaching like content, like they need to take this test. They need to do well on this test. And so thinking about how we bring this into the fold, one way to do that is thinking about when we talk about social emotional learning and the whole learner, and we talk about self-awareness or self-management, that actually means a lot of things to a lot of people, right? It actually, like, if we even just ask people, what's your definition of that? So how do we move that around so that we can impact the whole learner? And so what we do is we look at the competencies: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, social management. But then we also add in indicators. And some states and across the United States have standards and indicators for social emotional learning, but everybody does not. Some people don't even do social emotional learning, don't want it to be called that, right? That's a different conversation, another question that we can talk about later. But in terms of introducing it, like if we talk about self-awareness in indicator 1A or self-management indicator 2B, right? What it starts to do is, like, that's how teachers think. Teachers, if you go to an ELA teacher, they're like, teacher standard 2.1, this is going to teach students right? Because they're teaching the content, but we want to include all aspects. So now it becomes said teacher, Mr. Frame, how would you include these indicators 2.1, 3.1 in your instruction? You probably are in most cases already doing that, but it's not explicit and intentional, because what we want is to have, and then go to the second part of the question. When we do that, it gets to the impact where every single student in all aspects of the building, whether it's advisory, whether it's in math class, whether it's in extracurricular activities, they are seeing and learning that they are building these skills, which then allows for them to be able to articulate not just how their strengths, challenges, and needs academically, but also social emotionally, right? And when we have students who can say, well, the social emotional skill I'm working on is self-awareness, and I work on that in math class because sometimes I get a little bit of math phobia, but I use my self-awareness skill to move past my math phobia to then learn do the problem and complete the assignment. And now I'm fully confident what I can do in math, but I also am a future business leaders of America, and I work on self-awareness there, coupled with, I'm also trying to get better at mathematics. And like when you have a student be able to articulate that, like everybody sits and like, I earned my paycheck this week, like I did this. This is why I come to work every day. And I earned it because look at what the student can articulate around their social emotional skills and their academic skills simultaneously. So, but it really goes to really starting to hammer down for our teachers specifically, and even our leaders of buildings and of districts. Like, we have to really start taking these standards and indicators into doing that. Another thing I'll just share that has been that I'm working on my doctoral degree. So with some of the research that I've been doing, which is really fascinating, is that in terms of districts starting to create and really have the director of social emotional learning happening, what we do have to start to consider is what the title of that person is. And what we found, or what I'm finding, is if you change the title to Director of Social Emotional Learning and Academic Development, it changes completely what that person's role is. That it doesn't sit just in student support services. It's not just something else, but it, again, going back to the example of indicators, it starts to be looped into the academic side of the house. And this is something that we do to then impact the whole learner.
Boy, that's spectacular. I got to meet with the chief academic officer of Highline Public Schools in Washington. And so she talked about their SEAL program. And I'm like, tell me more. And it's social, emotional, academic learning. And it was the integration of those two. And to your point, when we're really intentional about how we approach student learning, it makes it a really big impact on there. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. So we spent a little bit of time talking about our passion. We spent a little bit of time talking about definitions. We talked about what it looks like within schools. I want to spend a little bit of time with a forward-looking plan. So my thought was we could do a quick poll around the perceptions of our audience members on where they are at this moment. And then we'll spend the next part of the session talking about how we can move from where we are to where we'd like to be. So I'm going to ask a quick poll question. Let's see. So which response best reflects your level of agreement with the following statement? So is there a persistent disconnect between the holistic set of skills and experience that every child needs and our current priorities in education? So is there dissonance in there? So do you strongly agree with that? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree? Or do you strongly disagree? So like four gradients in there. So while you're answering that, I wanted to reiterate that the research really backs up the claim that focusing on this student and this whole learner is super important. So Jen, talk to us a little bit about that research. I've heard you do so many great talks on the science of learning and it's super interesting. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Thank you. Well, I think Brandon really led us into the science piece when he began to allude to integration, right? This idea of these things really being important together, right? And Jason, you talked about that with the SEAL piece. It's really an exciting time in research right now because I've been in education for 35 years and up until 10 years ago, we were very compartmentalized in our understanding of different sciences and their impact on learning. Social sciences was sort of a soft science, and we didn't really think about that in the classroom in the same kind of ways. And we didn't have robust neuroscience that could really track all of the things that were happening in the brain as people learned. And what I really love is that we're at a place right now where we can actually map what is going on in the brain as people learn. And so what we're seeing is that it highlights that there are multiple disciplines that go into informing learning pedagogy, right? That social science and the development of relationships, which we've known, right, for 40 years, that the more connected you are to your parents and your teachers, the better you do in school, right? But that was not easily operationalized, but I would think all teachers would say like the relationship is important. We just didn't understand that completely. We think about neuroscience and the learning of the brain, all of the pieces of the brain that light up that we can't compartmentalize our emotions and leave them at the door, which is, what I was told like 25 years ago when I went to work. You leave your home life at the door and you come in and you suddenly turn on this other part of your brain. Like, that's not how our brains work. Psychology, social psychology, developmental psychology looks at engagement and self-efficacy, and this idea that it's not just about how much time you spend sitting in front of a computer or on a product or doing something, that it is, like Brandon was saying, right? He used the math phobia. I know everybody's like, yeah, math gets a bad rap there, but this idea of the emotion that blocks learning because you have this fear of your ability to do it, right? That is important in our ability to see learning in integrated ways. And so, research is telling us that it's not just a feel-good moment. It's not just this, thing that we do to help, that sort of is taking over for where other aspects of people's lives maybe haven't been able to address some of those needs. It is really about how we learn and how our brain works. I think about it. Here's my tangible example. You all have had a teacher where you're in the subject and you're like, I don't like this subject, but the teacher is so compelling. I had one, like math was that for me, honest disclosure. And I just wanted to learn everything from this teacher. And it made me so much more capable. I could do hard things in math because I had that relationship with that teacher, and it increased my learning aptitude. On the flip side, we've all had that class where we're like, oh, I'm really excited about this thing. And then you have a teacher who's like, and you go in and maybe you don't live up to your potential, or maybe it's you live up to your potential, but it's just because of the material. So, what research is telling us is we have to be in relationship with the person or the material in some kind of way. And so we're all trying to create systems that help people understand that changing pedagogy.
Well, thanks for sharing the science of it. I think that that's super important. I mean, Brandon mentioned, he was like, this is what we've all been doing. We know this is right, but to look at it through the lens of what does the science tell us exactly why this is right is super helpful. Now let's juxtapose that with our poll. So our poll was looking at the level of sort of disconnect between what we know we need to do and what's happening in the current priority sets of our schools. And it's probably not a big surprise to everybody that there's a pretty big disconnect there. So there's 67% says they strongly agree that there's a disconnect, and 33% say that they agree. So to some degree, there is definite dissonance between what we know we should do and what science tells us to do. So Brandon, I'm going to shift gears and talk from your perspective a little bit. So when we know what we should be doing. So at the Urban Assembly, how do you ensure that every student sort of has access to these really rich, high quality experiences that are challenging and that nourish your students as a whole learner?
Yeah, I love this, and just looking at the poll here, and that disconnect, and research would also say that. Research would say, or research shows, that 98% of principals believe that teaching social emotional learning skills is important. However, only 35% have a plan to do so. Only 25% are doing it with high quality, right? Mm-hmm. So that right there is your there's your issue, right? That implementation piece when it comes to that. And one way that we really try to move that forward is using diffusion of innovation theory, right? And so a lot of times we do have to look at social emotional learning. It is something that everybody's doing. It's not a new word. The definition has been around since the mid 90s, even before then, late 80s. However, it is still something that can be new to everyone. So we have to look at it as innovation. And so I want to just make this connection here. You have to think about it like the iPhone. You have to think about it like TikTok, about like Netflix, right? So at one point, where are people on this spectrum of adopting an innovation? Right. And so what are all the things you have to account for if you're going to bring an innovation? So everybody didn't have an iPhone, but now everybody has a smartphone. People were on Netflix when it first became a streaming platform, but then it's like, well, how did you become with Netflix, right? Somebody said, hey, have you seen the show? Right. Or, you share with, like me, I share with my mom. I don't pay for it. It's what it is. I'm just putting that out there. but I'm on Netflix. Right. And so thinking about that for social emotional learning, we have to kind of process it the same way. Is like, how do we create observability? How do we show relative advantage? How do we reduce complexity in terms of how do we create chiability around these things? So I think at the Urban Assembly, what we've done is to do that first by focusing on trying to do this in our 23 schools and thinking about what is the solution set, right? So a generalizable problem that we've already stated through research is implementation. And if we can look at that in terms of our 23 schools, and see, okay, how will we solve this? And then we come up with this generalizable solution that is then applicable no matter what setting you go to, we can move that forward. And so that's what we've been able to do at the Urban Assembly, and then scale that out so we can create schools that have both social emotional learning and academic development having simultaneously, because that's what we know what we need. And then on top of that, like, you can look at our YouTube page and you'll just see lots of videos. Like, it's so many videos. Like, sometimes I go somewhere, talk about what I'm doing, but then we know what I do. I put on a video. One of my favorite books that I have my whole department read is Switch. And in Switch, what they talk about, right, is the first one is how people, a lot of departments of education, school districts kind of work from this place of analyze, think, change, right? So people think that's how change happens, that you got to analyze, and then you think, you see some data, right? The research, so then you think about it, and then you should automatically change. That's not how people change. How people change is they see, they feel, they change. So we have to put the content, we have to put our young people out there. We have to put the voices of the people who are championing this work in different spaces and places. And then they're like, that is exactly what I want. My kids, what often happens at times when we do like SEL showcases is people will come and they're like, my kids don't talk like that. Right. So the research, well, yes, the research already says that, but they came and they saw and like, wow, this kid really articulated how they use social emotional skills to learn and improve their community from the school and at home. I want my kids to be able to do that. So I think that's never mind. That's yeah.
Tell you what, Brandon, I'm going to ask you one more question, and it's more from the practical side. And then, Sean, I'm going to end the session with our formal discussion before I get to audience questions with you. So, Brandon, when you think about this in practice, and you said one of the biggest challenges was sort of that implementation piece. Like, we know what the research says, we know what the science says, then there's this disconnect in implementation. Why? Why do you, just from your experience in working with these schools and change theory, like why does that disconnect exist, and what can we do about it?
I believe that disconnect exists. There's a few things. One is there's not an industry in the world, from education to business to the healthcare field, where there's a disconnect between the ivory tower and Front Street. There's a huge, like, what people are doing in the ivory tower and the research that's coming out, it does not always reach schools, and it definitely doesn't reach parents, right? There's like a huge disconnect there. So we do need to do something about how we take theory and practice and really bring that so that people are fully aware of the newest things and the ideas, the concepts that are out there, so that people can improve their communities. And then I think the next piece is that people want to continue to do what they've always been doing. We know that the pandemic highlighted social emotional learning is important, but what if people we got to get back to normal. We got to get back to what we've been doing, where we actually had an opportunity to turn everything on its head and reimagine what education can look like, and the things that we need to focus on. And I think that is what we're attempting to do. That's what everybody on here is attempting to do. And in the service of building SEL Nation, SEL World. And because we know if every single student is learning these skills, how they can be successful. So I think, change is hard. People don't necessarily want to see change or necessarily know how, right? Like, and this goes back to that theory, right? So like all these things that we're talking about, like, oh, that needs to be brought, like, and it's sometimes there's really simple things, but how do we take these concepts that are studied for hours and years and then make it very simple for people to digest and implement?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for letting us take that little pivot in the conversation. And Sean, I'm going to turn it over to you because, you said it perfectly when you said if we change from the shift from focusing on teaching content to teaching children. So when we think about that whole learner approach, and we think about sort of that intersection of all those skills that Jen talked about. So you've got executive function in there, you've got social and emotional learning, you've got academic needs in there. How do we balance that? It's a lot. So how do we balance that? Where do you start? So I figure we could sort of bring it back up to a higher level before we move to audience questions.
Yeah. And to be honest, I've noted down so many things that Brandon has been saying and Jen has been saying that I wanted to chime in about, regarding the book switch and regarding sort of, siloed aspects and so forth. We could keep chatting just between the three of us for probably another hour easily. So the intersection there, I think it really comes down to one, we already know what the research says, and we already know that. And we know inherently in our guts as well that if the child is not healthy and doesn't feel safe and doesn't have a relationship, that even if all we're doing is teaching content and we're teaching facts and figures, we already know that if they don't feel safe and connected and healthy, they're not even going to learn the content. So that should be a given. So we're talking about where do these things align, or how do we fit them together? They're already fitting together. And by ignoring the science and by ignoring the research, we're putting our children at a learning disadvantage. I sometimes ask in some keynotes and questions, which of these things affect the child's ability to learn? And I'll put things up on the board like, hunger, homelessness, violence, bullying, but I'll also put up there third grade reading level, third grade math level, truancy, disciplinary, and the answer will obviously be from the audience, well, all of these things will affect the child's ability to learn. But what we as educators are allowed or expected to focus on are third grade reading ability, disciplinary record, behavior, some other metric in a test. But we know these other things have equal or more ability to affect their ability to learn and thrive in the school. So why are we allowed to ignore those? Now, it doesn't mean we have to solve them. It doesn't mean we have to solve, we're not going to solve homelessness. But if you know the child is homeless, or if they're anxious, or if they're struggling, if you know that is an issue, then what the skillful teacher does is they adjust the teaching and learning that's going on in the classroom. They make a safer space for that child so that they can feel connected. Or if that child does not have a strong relationship with someone, then that teacher, that effective teacher, makes that relationship with that child. So part of it is understanding the research is there, and let's not ignore the research. The second thing about the alignment is, and I'd go back to what I was saying at the start, is let's, as educators, reflect on what is the purpose of education to start with. If you believe the purpose of education is to teach the 3 R's only and nothing else, then yeah, you can do that via the Khan Academy. You can do that via online learning. You can do that via, rote memorization and testing. But if you believe, like Brandon was saying earlier on, and quoting Maurice Elias about it's preparing you for the test of life, it's preparing you for society, it's preparing you to be part of the community and fulfill your potential, which when you ask the vast majority, if not every parent, that's what they think, then you need to develop the child holistically and more than just the academics. You need to prepare them to think for the future, like Jem was saying. You need to have them to understand their own self-efficacy and be self-aware of what they're going through and how they can navigate the world. So it comes down to 2. It's the research that's already out there, but it's also, let's not think about school as being what it was in theory 30, 40 years ago. School is this, the reason we put our children in school is to prepare them for life and society. And that's more than just the academics. It's not ignoring the academic side, but it's more than that.
Yeah. Can I add one quick piece that came out of that's different than what we've said, maybe? Sean was talking about, really, for me, this move from creating dependent learners to independent learners and the importance of that. And for me, that's also about the adults in the setting, that they're, this theory to practice idea, like we know, but what we do is not what we know. And that's that understanding the whole brain piece too. So for us as adults, we have default settings that we have learned over, for me, more than 50 years of growing up, right? Where I know theoretically that you don't yell at an ADHD child because it stimulates adrenaline, and adrenaline medicates them and reinforces their behavior. I had an ADHD child, and when he frustrated me after a certain point in time, I'd say, cut it out. And I knew better, right? So there are these things in between in our default settings that require the adults in the environment to practice themselves the change in these skill sets. And I think, Sean, that's one of the things you focus on in BTS, and certainly Brandon in implementation. But I don't want to lay all the blame on teachers. Like, there are these default settings in our structures and in our own brains that we have to really retool people on to change this learning pedagogy. And so I just wanted to add that one quick little piece.
I very much appreciate that. And I think ultimately, to summarize that, it would be that this work is hard and it's challenging and it's not a linear line in that. And I'm going to shift us to audience questions, because there is an elephant in some rooms that people want to address when it comes to this particular topic. And that's certainly not missing in the questions that have come up. And so let me just basically summarize this, and I'll ask it to each of you, because you each have different perspectives on this. And it says, have you found that the whole learner gets the same kind of negative reaction as SEL? It's one of the audience questions on there. So I'm curious how you would all answer that. I mean, Brandon, you're in the field. Do you see that?
So in some ways, yes. So this gets into, the polarization that has happened when it comes to social emotional learning. And so, like, whole learner is something that people can pick up on. Yeah, I want my kid to learn everything, right? And then social emotional learning becomes this, like, this is a liberal agenda to push just things, critical race theory. And so what I would say is that, I would say that the answer to the question is that it does not get the same negative reaction. How I've mitigated the negative reaction that does pop up is centering the conversation around skills, which it is a skills conversation, but really getting very serious about it and articulating it in that way, because there's no community, rural, urban, suburban, red state, blue state, purple state, that no person really says, I don't want my kids to have skills. Like, the people don't say that. It's like that's almost like something you wouldn't, it doesn't matter. You could be the most remote part of the earth, and they're going to say, yeah, there's certain skills that we need in order for our community to thrive. And having that conversation around social emotional learning. Now, we can have a conversation of what self-awareness is and some of those indicators that you might want in your respective community, completely open to that conversation, but we cannot deny that self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, social management, responsible decision-making, optimistic thinking are skills that every single human being needs to have in order for their community to thrive, no matter where that community resides.
Yeah.
Very good.
Can I jump in, Jason?
There's a question in the chat that, Jen, I think you might be well equipped to answer, and it says, how do we integrate the extreme importance of socialization and SEL into the reality and necessity of a virtual learning option in this age of teacher shortages and expansive academic gaps? That's a tough one.
Oh my gosh. So I see that Sean had a comment on the last one too, and we only have a little bit of time. So what I want to say just simply is that we have to, this is not a set aside. We've talked about that all day. So it is about helping people understand how to integrate it into what they're already doing, and creating features and content and in the digital landscape that elevate the science of how people learn and create time for people to do the things that we can't do, which are that tangible connection and safety in the environment, right? We can do some of that by reflecting all kids and all of that kind of stuff. But I think the integration piece is really important, and really that is about shifting our thinking, and we've been talking about that, and just seeing the opportunities in what we're already doing in important ways. And to just hit Brandon's thing about, we've all been doing this forever, right? Semantics gets in the way. Workforce development, people in jobs, they want to see skills of adaptability and collaboration and creativity. Those are the skills we're talking about. We can just talk about the skills, and I want to give Sean a minute here.
Sean, some final comments before I close out the session for today.
Yeah, I was going to follow on from what Brandon was saying beautifully as well. But it's to put it out there, the pushback against SEL and whole child or whatever is a political bogeyman. But it doesn't mean that the people who are concerned about it aren't concerned and passionate about their kids and what they're learning. And so there is an opportunity, even though we're in this confrontational time, to find common ground and meet people where they are. The people who may be politically motivated or anti, let's say, some semantics, if you ask them, they still want their children to learn, to be developed, to be independent thinkers, to be self-aware, to be empathetic, to be part of their community. I used to go around and do ask audience members, what do you want your child to be like at the end of schooling? And no matter where I went in red or blue states or urban or rural, it was the same answers. It was happy and healthy and empathetic and independent and a leader and a learner and caring. And so there is common ground that we can find as long as we tackle what the individual student and what their parents and community want them to learn, because no matter what we're calling it, it's really the same thing. So unfortunately, we were in this political world, but it's up to us to keep on moving this work forward, because this is what the children need in the future, as Jem was saying. And this is what teachers understand is good pedagogy and good education.
What's been really interesting to me is just this sort of serendipitous connection between the words that all of you have said. We didn't plan this. This is the first time that we've met together as a group, but just to hear the coherence and consistency that you all are focusing on when it comes to meeting the needs of our students. I want to say thank you, sincerely, thank you. Thank you for your hard work. This work is hard, but it's absolutely worth it in so many ways. And so thank you for your contribution today. Thank you for your contributions in the future. I just appreciate all of you taking the time to join us today. So I did want to say just a quick thank you to that. I also wanted to say thank you for everybody who joined us today. And there's like the chat's going crazy, and I wish we could have like a part 2 or part 3, or even extend this for longer, but we're sort of locked in on an hour. But we will come back and revisit this, because there's clearly a lot more interest from everybody. If you're looking for support in supporting the whole learner, Edmentum has several options that may help. We've got different tools that districts can use, and it's everything from developing those social and emotional awareness skills. It's assessments that identify exactly where students are, both academically and with their own level of SEL proficiency, and gives them tools to move that forward. In addition to that, we've got that connection between a student's mental health, their well-being, their social and emotional skills, and their executive functioning skills. When we talk a lot about those durability skills that students are going to need to be successful in the future, so that adaptability, those communication skills, collaboration skills, we have tools built in for that, as well as the academics. So it's the combination of everything. It's the combination of teaching the whole learner, but it's also in partnership with our school districts and schools who are providing some of those very basic needs for our student out there. So it's super exciting stuff. If you'd like to learn more, we're going to send out an email a little bit later today. It'll have a recording of this conversation in case you want to watch it again, or if you want to share it with some friends. It'll also have some links to the items that we've talked about. We'll also have a little survey at the pops up at the end. We want to make sure that this is resonant, appropriate, and meeting the needs for your times. If you want to learn more about any of it, just leave your email address and we will contact you again. Our next virtual event in the Perspective series will be on equity reform, November 16th. There's a link in the chat to register, and we hope to see you there. And maybe we'll end up with a part 2 of that series as well. I sincerely appreciate our speakers. The audience, thank you for joining today. This is Jason Mitchell signing off from Edmentum. Thank you and goodbye. Well, have a great day. Thank you. Thank you.